She was 22 and penniless, cast out from the only home she had ever known. With no family, no prospects, and no plan, she had only a small silver locket and the 20 pounds her stepmother had pressed into her hand as a final, sterile severance. And with 17 of those pounds, she bought a ruin on a desolate stretch of moorland in Westmoreland, a place called Kelver Castle on the county maps. But what nobody knew, what the maps could not show, was that hidden within the crumbling stone was a legacy left by another solitary woman, a secret that would give her not just a home, but a life. Settle in and join us for this story, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Hannah Shaw's world had once been as orderly and predictable as the columns in her father's ledgers. She grew up in the solid stone house attached to his wool merchant's offices in Kendal, a life measured in the scent of lanolin and coal smoke, the quiet scratch of a nib pen on heavy paper, and the low murmur of men discussing prices for Herdwick fleece. Her mother, a gentle woman with a love for the wildflowers that grew in the limestone gullies of the fells, had passed when Hannah was only 10. The loss left a quiet, hollow space in the house that was never filled. Hannah's sole inheritance from her was a small, oval silver locket, plain and unadorned, inside which lay a single, perfectly pressed primrose, its yellow faded to the color of old cream. After her mother's death, Hannah's education fell to Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman of immense practicality and few words. It was Mrs. Gable who taught Hannah the things that mattered: how to take up a hem so the stitches were invisible, how to make a nourishing broth from a chicken carcass and winter vegetables, how to listen to the sound of bread baking to know when it was done. More importantly, she taught Hannah how to manage a house, how to read accounts, and how to see the underlying structure of things, from a well-run pantry to a well-mended sheet. Her father, consumed by his grief and his business, was content to let her learn. He found comfort in her quiet competence, and by the age of 16, Hannah was keeping his books, her handwriting as neat and precise as any clerk's. For 6 years, this was her life, a world of numbers, routine, and the steady, unspoken affection of her father, and the quiet approval of Mrs. Gable. It was a small world, but it was secure. Then her father, at the age of 57, remarried. His new wife was the widowed daughter of a rival merchant, a woman named Eleanor with a sharp, assessing gaze and hands that were always cold. Eleanor saw the house not as a home, but as a statement, and Hannah not as a daughter, but as a fixture, like a piece of outdated furniture. The warm, worn patterns of their life were methodically replaced with new carpets, new rules, and a new, colder silence. Mrs. Gable was dismissed and replaced by younger staff who answered only to the new mistress. Hannah was relegated to her room, her duties in the office assumed by a hired clerk. Her father, seeming smaller and more tired in the face of his wife's brittle energy, did not intervene. He passed away less than 2 years later, a quiet departure after a short illness, leaving Hannah utterly alone in a house that no longer felt like hers. The ejection, when it came, was as quiet and bloodless as an entry in a ledger. A week after the funeral, Hannah was summoned to her father's study. The room smelled of beeswax and Eleanor's lavender water, a scent that had displaced the familiar aroma of pipe tobacco and old paper. Her stepmother was seated behind the great oak desk, a solicitor at her side, a man with a pale face and spectacles that seemed to magnify the lack of sympathy in his eyes. There was no argument, no raised voices. There was only a document, the last will and testament of Mr. Thomas Shaw. The solicitor read the relevant passages in a dry monotone. The house, the business, the accounts, everything was left to his beloved wife, Eleanor. Hannah's name was mentioned only once, in a codicil that bequeathed her the sum of £20 for her maintenance and future establishment. Eleanor did not look at her, She was busy examining her fingernails, as if the entire proceeding were a tedious but necessary piece of administrative tidying. "It was your father's wish," she said, her voice flat. He felt this was the most practical arrangement. The solicitor cleared his throat and slid a small stack of banknotes and coins across the polished surface of the desk. Hannah looked at the money, then at the woman who now owned her entire world. She saw no hatred in Eleanor's face, nor any pity. She saw only a placid, unbreachable indifference. There was nothing to say, nothing to fight for. The ledgers were closed. She stood, turned, and walked from the room without a word. In her own room, she methodically packed her small trunk. She took the 3 plain dresses she owned, her winter cloak, her sewing kit with the needles and threads given to her by Mrs. Gable, and the bookkeeping primer her father had given her on her 16th birthday. Lastly, she picked up the silver locket from her dressing table and secured the chain around her neck, the cool metal a familiar weight against her skin. She carried the trunk down the stairs herself. At the front door, Eleanor was waiting, holding the latch. She simply held the door open as Hannah passed through, a final, silent dismissal. The door closed behind her with a soft, definitive click. Standing on the pavement of the Kendall Street where she had lived for 22 years, Hannah Shaw looked down at the few coins in her purse and up at the gray, unforgiving sky. She had been neatly and efficiently erased from her own life. The journey north was a passage through gradations of gray. She paid the fare for a seat on the mail coach heading towards Penrith, a jarring, bone-shaking ride that carried her away from the familiar valley towns and into the wilder, emptier country of the high fells. She sat wedged between a silent farmer smelling of damp wool and a talkative woman with a basket of hens, and she watched the landscape change through the rain-streaked window. The tidy green fields gave way to vast, open moorland, brown and purple under the bruised autumn sky. Stone walls snaked over the hills like skeletal remains, and the sheep that dotted the slopes seemed less like domestic animals and more like fixtures of the land itself, as old and weathered as the granite tors. She left the coach at a small, wind-swept crossroads, the signpost pointing to Durnford, a village she knew only as a name on a map. The coach rumbled away, leaving her in a profound silence broken only by the cry of a curlew and the relentless sigh of the wind through the wiry heather. The rain, which had been a fine mist, thickened into a cold, persistent drizzle. She pulled her cloak tighter and began to walk, her trunk in one hand, a small carpet bag in the other. The road to Durnford was little more than a muddy track, and with every step, the hem of her dress grew heavier with cold water and grime. The air was sharp and clean, smelling of wet earth and distance. After an hour of walking, as the light began to fail, she saw it. High on a ridge to her left, silhouetted against the darkening sky, was a single square tower of stone. It was not a grand castle of fairy tale and romance, but something more primal and severe, a structure that seemed to have grown from the rock of the hill itself. It was a ruin, stark and solitary, a dark tooth clenched against the weather. It looked impossibly lonely, yet it also possessed a strange and forbidding beauty. It had endured. It was still standing. Hannah stopped on the muddy track, her breath misting in the cold air, and looked at the tower for a long time. She felt a peculiar sense of recognition, a kinship with its stark and stubborn solitude. It was a place where one could be entirely forgotten And in that moment, being forgotten felt less like a curse and more like a form of shelter. The rain ran in rivulets down her face, mingling with tears she was not aware she was shedding, and she knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that this was where she was going. The acquisition of Kelver Castle, as it was grandly named, took place not in a solicitor's office, but in the back room of a Durnford public house, where the county held its auctions for unclaimed and derelict properties. Hannah sat on a bench at the rear of the crowded, smoky room, a still, quiet figure in her dark cloak. She had spent 2 of her £20 on a week's lodging in the village, and she listened as parcels of land, abandoned cottages, and fallow fields were sold for modest sums. When the auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a florid face, finally announced, "Lot 34, the property known as Kelver Castle," a ripple of amusement went through the room. Comprising 1 stone keep or peel tower in a state of ruin, with approximately 1 acre of moorland grazing, he bellowed, "What am I bid for this fine piece of Westmoreland history?" A man shouted, "A shilling for the stone!" And the room erupted in laughter. The auctioneer banged his gavel. "We will start the bidding at £10. Silence. No one wanted a ruin on an exposed hill, a place fit only for sheep and ghosts. £5 then? He asked, his voice losing its bluster. More silence. Hannah felt her heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She took a breath, and in a voice that was clear but no louder than necessary said, £17. A hush fell over the room. Every head turned to look at the strange, pale young woman at the back. The auctioneer squinted, surprised. £17 from the lady. Do I hear 18? He looked around the room, but he was met only with shrugs and bewildered expressions. £17, going once, twice? He brought the gavel down with a sharp crack. Sold to the young lady for £17. The next day, with the deed, a single sheet of browning paper clutched in her hand, she walked back up to the castle. Up close, its strength was even more apparent than its decay. The walls were gray granite, 4 feet thick, stained dark with centuries of rain. The great oak door was bound with rusted iron straps, its lock long since seized. With a piece of fallen stone, she hammered at the bolt until it finally gave way with a groan of tortured metal. The interior was one vast, cavernous room on the ground floor. The air was cold and damp, smelling of stone dust and fallen plaster. A massive fireplace, wide enough to roast an ox, dominated one wall, its hearth choked with rubble and birds' nests. Light filtered down from a few high, narrow windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust. A spiral staircase of worn stone steps clung to the inside of one wall, ascending into darkness. Several steps were missing, making the upper floor inaccessible. The roof was a lattice of decaying timbers, open to the sky in several places. Rain had pooled on the stone flags of the floor. It was a ruin, just as they had said. But the walls were sound. The foundation was rock. And for the first time in weeks, Hannah Shaw was standing inside a place that was entirely her own. For weeks, her life settled into a rhythm of rudimentary survival. She used her remaining funds to buy a few essentials in Durnford, a sack of flour, a side of bacon, candles, a thick wool blanket, and a small cast-iron pot. She made a crude broom from a fallen branch and a bundle of heather and swept the debris from a corner of the great room. She patched the worst of the holes in the roof with scavenged pieces of slate and turf, a temporary measure that did little more than slow the ingress of the rain. She learned to build a fire in the great hearth that drew properly, coaxing a reluctant warmth into the damp stone. Her days were spent gathering firewood from the stunted trees that grew in the lee of the hill, and her nights were spent huddled by the fire, wrapped in her blanket, mending her worn clothes by the flickering light. It was a hard, solitary existence, but it was hers. The discovery came on a bitterly cold afternoon in late November. A persistent draft snaked across the floor from the base of the hearth, chilling her to the bone no matter how close she sat to the flames. Determined to find its source, she began clearing the last of the rubble from around the massive stone hearth. As she prized away a fallen block, she noticed that one of the large flagstones that formed the floor was not quite level with the others. It was a small discrepancy, one that would be easy to miss, but her eye, trained by years of searching for errors in columns of figures, caught it immediately. Curiosity piqued, she fetched a length of rusted iron, part of an old gate perhaps, and wedged it into the crack. Leaning on it with all her weight, she felt the stone shift with a low, grating sound. It was heavy, but it moved. With a final effort, she levered the flagstone up and to the side, revealing a small, dark cavity beneath. Reaching into the cold, musty space, her fingers brushed against something hard and metallic. She pulled it out. It was a lead box, about the size of a small book, heavy for its size and sealed with solder. Using the iron bar again, she broke the seal and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of what looked like dried moss, were 3 objects. The first was a small but heavy leather bag, tied with a drawstring. She loosened the knot and poured the contents into her palm. 30 gold sovereigns, their surfaces gleaming dully in the firelight. The second was a small object wrapped in linen, a carved wooden bird, a wren perhaps, its form simple but so full of life it felt warm to the touch. The last was a letter, a single sheet of paper, folded and sealed with a simple wafer of wax. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and unfolded it. The handwriting was clear and deliberate. The ink faded to brown. She held it to the light of the fire and began to read. To whomever finds this, my name is Elspeth Murray. I lived in this tower alone for 28 years, from 1810 until my passing in 1838. My husband was a shepherd and died on the fells, and my son was lost at sea. This place was my refuge. The world believes it a ruin, and I have let them. These coins are my savings, the whole of my life's thrift. I have no one to leave them to. If you have found this, it is because you have need of shelter, as I did. Use this money to make these walls strong again. Use it to buy your peace. Do not let them turn you out. This stone is a good friend to a lonely soul. I hope it serves you as well as it has served me. Hannah read the letter twice, her throat tight with an emotion she could not name. She looked from the careful script to the gold coins in her lap, to the small wooden bird. Elspeth Murray, a woman she had never known, had reached across a quarter of a century of silence and given her a future. She was not alone in the tower after all. The 30 sovereigns felt like a sacred trust. The next morning, Hannah walked the miles to Durnford, not with the desperation of a pauper, but with the quiet purpose of a builder. She did not spend the money on comforts, but on essentials for the tower itself. She found the local slater's yard and bought 100 prime Westmoreland slates, thick and green-gray, and bags of lime and sand for mortar. At the blacksmith's, she commissioned new iron pins for the door hinges and a simple latch. Her largest purchase was a single pane of glass, carefully wrapped in straw, to replace the rotted wooden shutters in one of the high windows. The carter who delivered the materials looked at her and the ruin on the hill with open disbelief, but he took her money and asked no questions. The real challenge was the work itself. She could not afford to hire labor, and even if she could, she felt a deep, abiding need to do this herself, to honor Elspeth Murray's legacy with her own hands. She began with the walls, mixing the lime mortar in a wooden bucket according to the instructions of a book she'd bought. The work was slow and arduous, forcing the mortar deep into the gaps between the stones with a small trowel. Her hands, accustomed to the delicate work of a pen, became chapped and raw, but with each section she repaired, the tower felt less like a ruin and more like a fortress against the wind. It was during this work that she first met Mr. Elias Thorne. He was an old man, stooped from a lifetime of working with stone, who had come up the path to graze his sheep. He watched her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Your mix is too wet. It'll shrink and crack when it cures." He did not offer to do the work for her. Instead, he took a handful of sand and worked it into her mortar, showing her how it should feel, thick and stiff like clotted cream. "There," he said, "that will hold for 100 years." He came by every few days after that, never staying long, offering a quiet word of advice on how to seat a slate so the rain would run true, or how to chip a stone to make it fit. He was teaching her the language of the stone, and she was a diligent student. One afternoon, a woman from a nearby farm, a Mrs. Albright, appeared at her door holding a basket. "Saw the smoke," she said by way of explanation. "Thought you might be hungry." Inside the basket was a loaf of fresh bread, still warm, a pot of mutton stew, and a small jar of gooseberry jam. Hannah, overwhelmed, could only stammer her thanks. Mrs. Albright just nodded. A body needs a hot meal when they're working hard. These were not acts of charity, but of recognition. They were acknowledgments of her labor, quiet gestures of respect that began to weave her into the fabric of this sparse, reserved community. Slowly, painstakingly, the tower was transformed. The roof became a solid, unbroken shield of green-gray slate, turning aside the worst of the Westmoreland rain. The newly glazed window allowed the pale northern light to pour into the great room, illuminating the clean-swept floor and the newly pointed walls. The spiral staircase was repaired, Hannah using the skills Mr. Thorne had taught her to shape and set new stone steps, giving her access to the upper chamber, a wide, airy room that she envisioned as her bedroom. The keep was no longer a shelter of last resort. It was becoming a home. As the tower became more habitable, the village of Durnford began to see her differently. She was no longer the strange girl who had bought the ruin, but Hannah Shaw of Kelver Keep. Her story, in its simple, unadorned facts, had spread through the quiet channels of rural life. They knew she had come with nothing and was single-handedly resurrecting a landmark they had long consigned to history. This earned her a measure of respect that money could not have bought. She found a use for the one skill she had brought with her from her old life. Hearing that the local farmers struggled with their accounts, she let it be known that she was proficient with ledgers. The first to approach her was Mr. Albright, a man of few words like his wife, who brought her a chaotic bundle of receipts and tally sheets. Hannah spent 2 evenings by her fire sorting them into perfect, balanced columns. When she presented him with the finished ledger, he stared at it in wonder. He offered to pay, but she shook her head. "A sack of potatoes and some firewood for the winter, if you can spare it," she said. It was the beginning of a new economy for her, one built on barter and mutual need. Her bookkeeping skills were exchanged for flour from the miller, eggs from a neighbor, and the occasional ride into town on a farmer's cart. She became a part of the life of the place, a quiet but necessary hub in the community's affairs. Her days took on a comforting rhythm. She would wake with the light, stoke the fire, and drink hot tea while looking out her new window at the vast, shifting panorama of the moor. The days were for work, tending her small, newly dug vegetable patch, maintaining the keep, doing her accounting. And the evenings were for peace, for reading by the fire, the wind howling harmlessly outside her thick stone walls. She was not just surviving, she was thriving in a way she had never imagined possible. One winter evening, with a thick blanket of snow silencing the world outside, Hannah sat before the great hearth. The fire cast a warm, dancing light across the stone walls of her home. The room was sparsely furnished. A simple wooden table and 2 chairs she had bought from the village carpenter, a bed she had built herself in the chamber above, and shelves holding her few books and dishes. But it was filled with a profound sense of peace. On the heavy stone mantelpiece, 2 small objects sat side by side. One was her mother's silver locket, polished until it shone, containing its fragile, faded primrose. The other was Elspeth Murray's carved wooden wren, its surface worn smooth by a hand that had held it for comfort through long, solitary years. She looked at the 2 objects, these small testaments left by the 2 women who had, in their own ways, saved her. Her mother had given her a memory of unconditional love, a talisman she had carried through her darkest days. Elspeth Murray, a stranger bound to her only by a shared need for sanctuary, had given her the means to build a future. And between them was Mrs. Gable, who had given her the practical skills, the quiet competence that had allowed her to take what she was given and make something of it. She thought of her stepmother, Eleanor, and the cold, polished house in Kendal. There was no anger left, no bitterness. That life felt as distant and unreal as a story read in a book. The solicitor's letter that had seemed like a sentence of destitution had, in fact, been a key, unlocking a door to a life of purpose and belonging she could never have found in her father's house. She had learned the language of stone and wind, the satisfaction of labor, and the quiet grace of a neighbor's kindness. She had come to the moor with nothing but a memory and a handful of coins, seeking only to disappear. Instead, she had found herself. Hannah Shaw was 23 years old and had been cast out with nothing. She had 17 pounds to her name, and she had spent it all on a ruin. It was the best 17 pounds she had ever spent. Thank you for joining us for this story of resilience and renewal. We hope it brought a little warmth and quiet to your day. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing to our channel and sharing it with someone who might appreciate a story of finding home in unexpected places. And we'd love to leave you with a question. What is something that others saw as worthless, that you were able to see the hidden value in? Let us know in the comments below. We'll see you next time.